Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Share Office's second video in our Building a Culture of Consent video series. And in this video, we invite you to think about how to implement and navigate consent in the context of romantic and intimate relationships. Our agenda will be as follows. First, we're going to evaluate what it means to build a culture of consent. Second, we are going to analyze personal needs, wants, curiosities, and boundaries. Third, we are going to teach you how to learn to understand your partner's boundaries. Fourth, we are going to introduce the consent castle metaphor. Fifth, we'll discuss challenges to expect when communicating needs and boundaries. Sixth, we'll give some tips on how to make these interactions easier. And lastly, we'll talk about the benefits of communication. And before we get started, let's introduce our facilitators for today. My name is Melina Solis. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a Share Education Team student staff member.
Hi, my name is Nadia Callie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the professional staff members in the Share Education Team, specifically the Education and Outreach Specialist.
Hi, I'm Brianna Booth. I use she, her pronouns. I am also a part of the Share Education Team, and I am the Director of Positive Sexuality.
Awesome. And if you haven't already, please be sure to watch our Part 1 Introduction to Consent video in our Building a Culture of Consent series. Now, before we dive into relationship-oriented consent, we'd like to take a step back and evaluate what it means to establish a culture of consent. Fostering a culture of consent in our relationships, our social groups, our university, and our society at large requires normalizing the acts of asking for consent and respecting consent across the board, not just in sexual situations. This means putting more intentional thought into our daily actions until asking for consent becomes second nature. We should remember to ask permission before tickling a family member, saying, "Do you want to have a tickle fight?" Before posting a photo of a new relationship on social media, saying, "I really love this photo of us. Would it be okay if I post it on my Instagram?" You should ask permission before sharing a friend's personal information, asking, "Is this something you would prefer to keep between us?" And ask permission before inviting someone over to a shared space, asking, "Hey roommate, is it okay if I bring over a few friends tomorrow?" It's important to ask sincerely for their permission and respond with care and sincerity so that they understand it's okay to say no and that you will respect their bodily autonomy and their privacy. And this is how we start to establish a culture of consent. Additionally, it's important to understand that pleasure and consent do exist outside the scope of sexual experiences and can include friendships, family, playing with pets, and taking time for yourself. These pleasurable activities are a core part of our lives, and in order to engage in them, we need to be aware of preferences, needs, and boundaries. Therefore, consent is a fundamental part of these activities.
So, how do we navigate our own boundaries, consent, and pleasure? Well, a great first step is to sit for a moment and think to yourself, what do I like and need? What are my limits and boundaries? We can break this down into 4 different quadrants: needs, wants, curiosities, and boundaries. What are your needs? These could include always asking before initiating a kiss or consistent contraception usage. What are your wants? For example, words of affirmation or lots of cuddling or non-sexual touching. What are your curiosities? Are there things you're curious about or things you'd maybe like to explore in your relationship? Maybe it's exploring a new sexual position like 6'9", or going on a double date. What are your boundaries? These boundaries can fall into 3 different categories, such as physical boundaries, including degrees of intimacy, PDA, emotional boundaries, such as time apart or saying I love you, and even digital boundaries, such as social media and texting expectations. It's important to be honest with our needs, wants, curiosities, and boundaries. If we are honest with ourselves about what we want, we are more likely to feel happy and fulfilled in our relationships. whether they are friendships, dating relationships, or something else. How can we express what we've learned to our partners? You can start off the conversation by saying, I've been thinking about our sex life, relationship, fill in the blank, and there are a few things I'd like to talk about with you. Are you open to that? Then you can follow up with specifics. Here are some helpful examples of discussing your needs, wants, curiosities, and boundaries with your partner. Some needs may be, we need to use condoms every time. I'm not comfortable having sex without it. Or, I need you to respect my gender. Please use my correct pronouns. Examples of wants could include, one of my love languages is words of affirmation. I'd appreciate it if we could say these things more often to each other. What do you think? Or, meditation is part of my regular spiritual practice. Would you be interested in exploring this with me? Examples of curiosities could include, I'm interested in trying kink. Would you be open to exploring that with me? Or, I haven't been to that part of the Bay Area yet. Are you interested in going with me? Explaining boundaries could be framed like, I know that you enjoy sharing your personal life on social media, but could you please not post any pictures of me or us? I'm not out to my family. Please don't try to control what I do. I would not feel respected if you told me I couldn't hang out with certain people or wear certain clothes. So moving beyond ourselves, we must also have an open and honest conversation with the other person to know and understand what they want and need and what their boundaries are. It's incredibly important to have a clear conversation about wants and needs and mutual understanding of boundaries before any interaction takes place, especially when in a new relationship. Ensuring that you and your partner feel safe and respected should be a priority. If you're unsure about how your partner feels about a certain action, ask. It's much better to ask and know for sure than to assume and risk placing your partner in an uncomfortable or unsafe situation. In addition to direct questions, it is also helpful to pay attention to body language, cues to gauge how they feel. For example, if you are doing something together and you notice that they're pulling away or disengaging, this is likely a sign that they are uncomfortable. It's important to stop and ask how they feel.
One frequently asked question is whether the way consent works can change over the course of a relationship. The answer is yes. One of our favorite metaphors to explain consent is the consent castle. We'll explain using a comic created by Everyday Feminism. Consent isn't a checkbox, and it isn't just a legal entity. Consent is a tool to build strong, intimate, sexual, and romantic relationships. When you start out practicing careful and explicit consent, you're building a consent castle that you both can enjoy. How does it work? Well, imagine you've met someone awesome and you decide that you want to build a castle together. In other words, plan some sexy times. You'll probably talk about what you want and what you don't want. You might even draw up some diagrams. You can talk about your experiences. And it's a good idea to check in to see how it's going. The point is, when you're building something with someone, you usually start out being really careful. You use scaffolding and wear hard hats and steel-toed boots. You communicate a lot to make sure you're both on the same page. It might seem like a lot of work, but it's also a lot of fun. You're building something you're both going to enjoy. You don't have to take these precautions, and maybe everything will be okay. But we use this level of care knowing that someone might be uncomfortable or potentially get hurt. As you build your castle, you'll finish rooms and you'll both get used to the space. If you've built it right, you don't have to wear hard hats all the time because it becomes a safe, comfortable, familiar space. By being careful and deliberate with consent early on with someone new, you can build a solid foundation for a mutually satisfying relationship. Together, you'll develop your skill of attunement, becoming attuned to one another's body language, moods, pleasure, and boundaries. As you get better attuned, you may not need explicit consent for every intimate act, but the skill of explicit communication will be essential as two people are always changing. In other words, this familiarity doesn't mean that conversations about consent are over. The great thing about consensual relationships is that they are a work in progress and sometimes may need to do some maintenance. You might want to add a new room or refurbish an old one. In other words, explore something new sexually. In that case, you put your hard hats back on and plan things out a little more carefully. These consent conversations are healthy. We hope you take away something new from this consent castle metaphor about establishing consent before and during intimacy and how to adjust the negotiation terms as you build a relationship. There are also some challenges that we should expect when finding out another person's needs and boundaries. First, these conversations can be awkward. Embrace it. It is much better to have a slightly awkward discussion about needs and boundaries now than to have you or the other person feel uncomfortable or unsafe later on. Second, the other person's boundaries and needs may not align with yours. This can be difficult to navigate and hard to hear. For example, you may need a lot of casual touch to feel emotionally connected, but your partner doesn't feel comfortable with that. It's important to communicate honestly to better understand how to best meet each other's needs and boundaries. Third, it can be vulnerable and uncomfortable to share that conversation with someone. We'll give some tips on how to make these conversations easier in the next section. Fourth, we must also look into how identity plays into our needs and boundaries. Consent is different for each person based on their experience, the context that they live in, and the situation itself. For example, people who are exploring their sexuality may need some time to navigate consent and verbalize boundaries in unfamiliar, intimate contexts. A recent study of sexual minority college students by Olin et al. Noted that assault prevention programs typically approach dating violence and sexual assault education from a heteronormative perspective, contributing to sexual minorities' feelings of invisibility and confusion when it comes to consent. For example, outdated ideas that men are the askers or initiators and women are the gatekeepers are incredibly limiting and harmful to all and don't truly encompass the reality that consent needs to be mutual, ongoing, and affirmative, no matter what identities people have. Thus, we want to stress that everyone, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, must ask affirmative consent and they also deserve to have their boundaries respected.
So how can we make these interactions easier? Well, here are a few tips. First, be brave. Remember the consent castle. Being careful and explicit with consent early establishes the foundation for a healthy relationship based on mutual respect. Second, speak your truths. Communicating your needs, wants, boundaries, and curiosities can help you feel safe, respected, and fulfilled in your relationships. Next, you should ask questions, even if it makes you uncomfortable. Knowing the answers to these questions early can help you and your partner feel more comfortable in the long run. Fourth, make time and space for the person to answer honestly. Avoid words, tones, and body languages that can make your partner feel guilty or uncomfortable answering honestly, including them saying no. Fifth, it's important to learn to respect and handle no. It doesn't affect your self-worth. Think of how you'd want your partner to respect your boundaries. And last, be gentle and patient with yourself and your partner. Consent and intimacy are processes that evolve over the course of a relationship, and we are always learning in this arena, and it takes time to establish trust and comfort. So what are the benefits of communicating needs and boundaries? Well, one, you maximize collective and personal pleasure and enjoyment. Two, you minimize harming other people and minimizing other people getting hurt. Third, you learn more about yourself and what you like, as well as about them and what they like. And last, the benefit of communication is helping you form a positive and healthy connection.
So being attuned to yourself and another person is an ongoing practice. Setting and establishing healthy boundaries is also a skill, and it takes time. Remember, making connections through attunement and healthy boundaries don't always come easy. But if you trust your instincts, be open, and practice with your partner, the relationship will only get stronger over time. Thank you for watching this video on relationship-oriented consent in part 2 of our Building a Culture of Consent series. If you haven't already, be sure to watch our Introduction to Consent in our next video on community-oriented consent. To continue your learning, there are a variety of Share Education Team videos that you can watch on our website or by emailing sarahoffice@stanford.edu. You can also visit sarah.stanford/learn-more for more information on a variety of related topics. Lastly, if you'd like to contact our team, please email sarahoffice@stanford.edu and we can schedule an appointment. Thank you for listening and learning.